They said the war beast had never bowed. Not to kings, not to death, not even to the moon itself. But tonight, something in the air felt wrong. The chains groaned under tension. Thick iron links stretched across the stone arena, each one anchored deep into the ground, yet still trembling as the creature at the center shifted its massive weight, its breath rolling out in slow, heavy waves that stirred dust and fear alike, and every wolf in the crowd kept their distance, instinct screaming louder than pride. Because this was no ordinary beast, this was the Alpha King's weapon, the thing sent where no army could stand, the thing that ended wars before they truly began, and it had never once been controlled, only pointed. Elena Whitmore stood at the far edge of the arena, her thin cloak pulled tight against the cold evening air, though it did nothing to stop the quiet trembling in her hands, not from fear alone, but from something deeper, something she had long learned to hide, because an Omega like her was not meant to feel too much, not meant to be seen at all, just another shadow moving through a world built for stronger wolves. And yet tonight, she had been dragged here, not invited, not asked, simply taken, her name called like an afterthought when the handlers ran out of options, when even seasoned warriors refused to step closer, and the laughter that followed her entrance had not been loud, but it had been sharp, cutting in the way only quiet cruelty could be, because everyone knew what this meant. Everyone knew what happened to those sent forward when no one else would go. She kept her head lowered as she stepped onto the packed earth, each footfall measured, steady, even as the ground beneath her seemed to hum with something alive, something watching. And when she finally lifted her eyes, it wasn't to the crowd, not to the guards or the nobles seated high above, but to the creature itself, towering, silent now, its gaze locked onto her with an intensity that made the rest of the world fall away. And for a moment, just one fragile moment, the noise, the tension, the fear, it all faded into something quieter, something almost familiar, like a memory she couldn't quite reach. A handler shouted from somewhere behind her, telling her to move, to do something, but Elena didn't react, not immediately, because the beast had shifted again, not forward, not aggressive, but curious, its massive head lowering just slightly as if trying to understand what stood before it. And that was when she felt it. Not fear, not exactly, but a pull, subtle and steady, threading through her chest and down into her fingertips, urging her forward despite everything she had ever been taught, despite every warning etched into her bones since childhood. And against all reason, she took another step, then another, closing the distance inch by inch until the air between them grew warm, thick with something unseen, something undeniable. And though her breath hitched softly, she did not stop, because somewhere deep inside, beneath the years of silence and shame, something long forgotten was beginning to wake. And the war beast, silent, unyielding, unstoppable, did not move to stop her. The distance between them shrank to less than 3 feet, close enough for Elena to feel the heat of its breath against her skin, steady and powerful, carrying a scent unlike anything she had ever known, something ancient, like rain on stone and fire buried deep beneath the earth. And yet there was no movement from the creature, no sudden strike, no sign of the uncontrollable force everyone had warned her about, only those eyes, fixed on her with a depth that made her chest tighten, as if it was not just looking at her, but through her, into something she did not even understand herself. Behind her, the murmurs began to shift, confusion replacing certainty, because this was not how the story was supposed to unfold. This was not how the war beast responded, and even the handlers fell silent, their commands dying in their throats as the moment stretched longer than anyone could explain. Elena swallowed slowly, her fingers trembling at her side before she forced them still, because something inside her refused to step back, refused to turn away, even as every instinct she had been raised with told her she should run, that she should lower her gaze and disappear like she always had. But instead, she lifted her chin just enough to meet the creature fully, her breath uneven but her eyes clear, and for the first time in her life, she did not feel small. The air shifted again, subtle but undeniable, like the quiet before a storm that never came, and the creature lowered its head another inch, not in aggression, but in something that felt almost like recognition. And that was when the memory flickered, quick and fragile, a moment from years ago when she had been no more than a child, lost at the edge of the forest, her hands glowing faintly without explanation as a wounded animal had stilled beneath her touch, her mother's voice whispering urgently that she must never let anyone see, that what she carried was not a gift the world would welcome. And then the memory was gone, swallowed by the present, leaving only the echo of something she had never been allowed to understand. A sharp voice finally broke through the silence, demanding that she step back, that she stop whatever this was before it went too far. But Elena barely heard it, because the pull in her chest had grown stronger, warmer, spreading through her arms and into her fingertips like sunlight finding its way through cracks in stone. And before she could second-guess herself, before fear could reclaim its place, she lifted her hand slowly, carefully, every movement deliberate as if guided by something beyond thought. And the crowd held its breath, waiting for the inevitable moment, when everything would shatter. Her hand hovered just inches from the creature's face, close enough to feel the faint vibration of its breath, and for a heartbeat, nothing happened. The world suspended in a fragile balance that could break with the slightest shift. And then, gently, impossibly, she let her fingers rest against its fur. The contact sent a quiet ripple through her, not pain, not shock, but a deep, resonant warmth that settled into her bones, steadying her in a way she had never experienced before. And the creature responded, not with force, not with resistance, but with stillness, a profound, deliberate stillness that seemed to spread outward, calming the tension in the air itself. Elena's breath caught as she realized it was not pulling away, not resisting her presence, but allowing it, accepting it. And the realization sent a wave of disbelief through her, because nothing in her life had ever responded to her this way. Nothing had ever chosen her. And yet here, in the center of a place where she was meant to be nothing more than a sacrifice, something extraordinary was unfolding. The creature's massive form shifted again, slower this time, more controlled, and then, inch by inch, it lowered itself, not collapsing, not weakening, but bending, as if acknowledging something unseen, something that existed between them in a language no one else could hear. And a collective breath swept through the arena, sharp and disbelieving, because this was not submission born of force. This was something else entirely, something that no training, no command, no chain had ever achieved. Elena's heart pounded in her chest, loud enough that she was certain everyone could hear it, but she did not pull her hand away. She did not break the connection, because for the first time, the fear that had defined her life was no longer the strongest thing inside her. And in its place, something steadier had taken root, something that felt dangerously close to belonging. High above, where the shadows of the upper tier concealed the most powerful figures in the kingdom, a presence shifted, silent but unmistakable, and though Elena could not see him yet, could not feel the weight of his gaze fully, the moment had already reached him, already changed something that could not be undone. Because what was happening below was not just rare, it was impossible, and impossibility had a way of rewriting everything. The creature exhaled slowly, its breath brushing against her hand like a quiet acknowledgement, and Elena closed her eyes for just a second, grounding herself in the warmth of it, in the strange, unspoken understanding that had formed in the space between them. And when she opened them again, the world had not returned to what it was before, because somewhere in the silence, something had shifted, something that would not be ignored. And though she did not yet know what it meant or what it would cost, she could feel it as clearly as her own heartbeat, the beginning of something that would change not just her fate, but the fate of everyone watching, whether they were ready for it or not. The moment did not break. It deepened, stretching into something heavier, something undeniable, as if the world itself had paused to witness what should not exist. And Elena felt it in the way the air pressed gently against her skin, in the way her breath slowed without her telling it to, in the way the creature beneath her hand remained still, not out of restraint, but out of choice. And that realization settled into her chest with a quiet force that both steadied and unsettled her, because nothing in her life had ever chosen her before. The arena, once filled with restless energy and expectation, had fallen into a silence so complete that even the faint rustle of fabric from the distant stands sounded too loud. And somewhere beyond her immediate awareness, people were shifting, leaning forward, trying to understand what their eyes were showing them, trying to find a reason that fit within the rules they had always known. But there was no rule for this, no explanation that could contain it. Elena's fingers remained where they were, resting lightly against the creature's fur, and she became aware of the texture beneath her touch, not rough or wild as she had imagined, but thick and warm, carrying a steady pulse of life that echoed faintly through her palm. And with it came that same warmth again, stronger now, spreading through her arm and settling deep within her chest like a quiet flame that refused to be ignored. She inhaled slowly, her senses sharpening in a way that felt unfamiliar yet natural. And for the first time, she noticed the subtle shifts in the creature's breathing, the way it adjusted not in agitation, but in response to her presence, as if they were connected by something invisible yet real, something that did not require words or commands. A faint sound broke from the creature then, not a growl, not a warning, but something softer, something almost like a low hum that resonated in the space between them, and Elena felt it more than she heard it, a vibration that traveled through her hand and into her chest, aligning with that strange warmth until the two became indistinguishable, and her heart skipped once, then steadied, as if it had found a rhythm it had been searching for without knowing. She swallowed, her throat dry, and though she knew she should be afraid, should be overwhelmed by the impossibility of what was happening, she found that the fear had shifted into something else entirely, something quieter but far more powerful, a sense of being seen, not as the Omega they had labeled her to be, not as the shadow she had learned to become, but as something whole, something that existed beyond the limits placed on her. A movement from above finally drew a flicker of awareness to the upper tiers, where figures cloaked in authority stood partially hidden in shadow, their presence heavy even at a distance. And though Elena did not lift her gaze fully, she could feel it now, the weight of attention focused on her, sharper and more deliberate than before, and it sent a subtle tension through her shoulders, a reminder that whatever this moment was, it was no longer hers alone. A voice, low and controlled, cut through the silence then, not loud, but carrying an authority that required no force. And though she could not make out every word, the tone alone shifted the atmosphere, drawing a line between what had been chaos and what would now be observed, measured, judged, and the crowd responded to it instinctively, their murmurs fading into a tense quiet that mirrored the stillness at the center of the arena. Elena's fingers twitched slightly, not in fear but in awareness, and the creature responded immediately, its head lowering just a fraction more, pressing into her touch with a deliberate gentleness that made her breath catch, because it was not submission alone, it was acknowledgement, and the distinction mattered in a way she could not fully explain but felt deeply. Her eyes softened as she looked at it, really looked this time, taking in the subtle details she had missed before, the faint lines that traced across its form like patterns shaped by time itself, the intelligence in its gaze that went beyond instinct, beyond training, something ancient and aware, and the realization came quietly but firmly. This was not just a beast, not just a weapon. It was something more, something that had been forced into a role it did not choose, much like her. The thought lingered, fragile but persistent, and for a brief moment, the space between them felt less like a distance and more like a shared understanding. Two beings placed in a world that had already decided what they were meant to be, now standing in a moment where those definitions no longer held. The warmth in her chest pulsed again, stronger this time, and she inhaled sharply as it spread outward, not overwhelming, but undeniable, and with it came a faint whisper of something she could not quite hear, not a voice, not exactly, but an impression, a sense of being called, of being recognized in return, and it sent a quiet shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with fear. Above, the unseen observer shifted again, closer now, the weight of his presence no longer distant but pressing, focused, and though Elena did not yet understand why, she felt it as clearly as the creature beneath her hand. Something had changed in the balance of power in this place, something that would not be undone simply because it was inconvenient. The creature exhaled once more, slow and steady, and then, with a movement so deliberate it felt almost ceremonial, it lowered itself further, its massive form, settling into a position that no one present had ever witnessed before, not commanded, not forced, but given freely, and the collective breath that followed was not loud, but it carried a weight of disbelief that echoed far beyond the arena. Elena stood there, her hand still resting gently against it, her heart steady despite everything. And though she did not yet know what this meant, did not yet understand the consequences that would follow, she felt the truth of it settle into her bones with quiet certainty. This moment was not an accident, and whatever had awakened within her, whatever had answered from within the creature, it had been waiting for her, for this, for a reason that was only just beginning to unfold. "Do you feel it?" The voice came low, controlled, cutting through the stillness like a blade wrapped in silk. And this time Elena heard it clearly, not with her ears alone, but somewhere deeper, where that strange warmth had settled, and her breath caught as the world around her seemed to shift again, not outwardly, but in the way everything suddenly felt more defined, more present, as if a new layer of reality had been pulled into focus. She did not turn immediately, though every instinct told her who that voice belonged to, because the creature beneath her hand responded first, its body tensing for a fraction of a second before relaxing again, not in fear, but in recognition, and that subtle reaction told her more than any warning could have. Slowly, carefully, she lifted her gaze just enough to see him descending from the elevated platform, his steps measured, unhurried, yet carrying a weight that pressed against the air itself, and though no one announced his presence, no one needed to, because the shift in the crowd was immediate, heads lowering, bodies stilling, the kind of silence that came not from command, but from instinct, from knowing exactly who stood before them. King Lucian Blackthorn did not look at the crowd, did not acknowledge the tension or the disbelief that lingered in every corner of the arena, his attention fixed entirely on the center, on her, and on the creature that had done what it had never done before, and there was something in his gaze that was not easily defined, not anger, not confusion, but something sharper, something searching. Elena felt it settle on her like a physical weight, and for a brief moment, the steadiness she had found wavered, not because she was afraid of him, but because she understood, without being told, that whatever had just happened, he would not ignore it, and neither would anyone else. The warmth in her chest pulsed again, as if responding to his presence, and she inhaled slowly, grounding herself in that sensation, because it was the only thing keeping her from stepping back, from returning to the small, invisible place she had always occupied, and she could not explain why. But she knew she could not retreat now, not after this. The king stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could see the details she had only heard about in whispers, the sharp lines of his expression, the stillness that spoke of absolute control, and most of all, his eyes, silver like polished steel, reflecting nothing and everything at once. And when they met hers, the silence between them deepened, not empty, but charged with something unspoken. "Step away," a voice called from behind him, tense and uncertain, but Lucian did not move, did not repeat the command, and that alone was enough to silence anyone else who might have spoken, because if he was not intervening, then no one else would dare. Elena's hand remained where it was, resting against the creature, and she became suddenly aware of how impossible that looked, how it must appear to everyone watching. An Omega standing untouched beside something that no one else could approach, and yet the thought did not fill her with shame, not this time, because the connection she felt was too real to deny. The creature shifted again, its massive head turning slightly toward the king, and for a moment, something passed between them, something old and familiar, something that did not belong to this moment alone, and then, slowly, deliberately, it lowered itself further, its posture unmistakable now, not just calm, not just still, but deferential, a gesture that had never been given freely, and the effect rippled outward, breaking through the last remnants of disbelief in the crowd. A quiet murmur rose, quickly stifled, but impossible to fully contain, because everyone understood what that meant, even if they did not understand why. Elena's breath trembled slightly as she felt the shift, not in the creature, but in the space around them, as if an invisible line had been crossed, something irreversible, and she glanced briefly toward the king. just enough to see the change in his expression, subtle but undeniable, the sharp edge of calculation giving way to something else, something deeper, something that recognized the weight of what he was witnessing. "What are you?" he asked, his voice quieter now, not a demand, not an accusation, but a question that carried more weight than any command, and it caught her off guard, not because of the words themselves, but because of the way he said them, as if he was not speaking to a servant, not speaking down, but seeking an answer he could not find on his own. Elena swallowed, her throat tight, and for a moment, she did not know how to respond, because she had asked herself that same question more times than she could count, had been given answers that never felt complete, never felt true, and now, standing here with the weight of the king's gaze on her and the quiet presence of the creature beside her, she realized she still did not have one. "I do not know," she said finally, her voice soft but steady, and though the words felt small compared to the moment, they were the only truth she had. The silence that followed was different from before, no longer filled with uncertainty, but with something else, something building, something waiting. And Lucian's gaze did not leave her, as if he was measuring something beyond her words, something he could not yet define but refused to ignore. The warmth in her chest flared once more, stronger than before, and she felt it respond not only to the creature, but to him as well, linking the three of them in a way that made her pulse quicken, because this was no longer just a moment of survival, no longer just an impossible event in an arena filled with witnesses. This was something else entirely, something that had drawn the attention of the one person who could change everything. And though Elena did not yet understand the path that had opened before her, she could feel it, as clearly as the ground beneath her feet, the quiet certainty that whatever came next, there would be no returning to the life she had known before. "Then we will find out," Lucian said quietly, and the words settled into the space between them with a weight that felt both like a promise and a warning. And Elena felt her breath catch as something in his tone shifted, not harsh, not cold, but resolute in a way that left no room for doubt. And for the first time since he had stepped into the arena, she understood that whatever this moment meant, he had already decided it mattered. The creature beneath her hand exhaled slowly, its breath warm against her skin, and as if in response to the king's words, it lowered its head just a fraction more. The gesture subtle but unmistakable, and Elena felt the connection between them pulse again, stronger now, as if something unseen was tightening, aligning, drawing lines that had not existed before. The crowd remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of shock. It was the silence of anticipation, the kind that built slowly, like a storm gathering just beyond the horizon. And though no one spoke, everyone was waiting, watching for what would come next, for how the king would respond to something that defied everything they believed about power and control. Elena's fingers curled slightly against the creature's fur, not gripping, just grounding herself in the warmth that continued to steady her. And she became aware of how different she felt from the girl who had stepped into the arena minutes ago. The fear that had once defined her now distant, replaced by something she could not fully name but could not deny. Something that made her stand a little straighter despite the weight of every gaze upon her. Lucian took one more step closer, closing the distance until he stood just beyond the reach of the creature's lowered form. And still, it did not react with hostility, did not rise or resist, only remained where it was, its attention divided, yet calm, as if acknowledging both of them in a way that defied the hierarchy everyone understood. His gaze flickered briefly to the creature, then back to Elena, sharper now, more focused, as if he was testing something, measuring the invisible thread that had formed between them, and the faintest narrowing of his eyes suggested that whatever he saw confirmed something he had not expected but could not ignore. "Remove your hand," he said at last, his voice steady, not commanding, but deliberate, and the request carried a weight that made Elena hesitate, not because she feared disobedience, but because the idea of breaking the connection felt wrong in a way she could not explain. For a moment, she did not move, her breath shallow as she considered the request, and the warmth in her chest pulsed again, almost in protest, as if whatever had awakened within her did not want to be severed so easily. Slowly, carefully, she began to withdraw her hand, her fingers lifting from the creature's fur one by one, and the moment the contact broke, the air shifted again, not violently, not sharply, but enough for her to feel the absence immediately, like stepping out of sunlight into shadow, and her chest tightened as the warmth dimmed, though it did not disappear entirely. The creature responded at once, its head lifting slightly, not in aggression, but in awareness, as if noticing the change just as clearly as she did, and for a brief second, Elena felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, something that almost felt like disappointment, though she could not be sure if it was hers or something shared between them. Lucian watched closely, his expression unreadable, but his attention unwavering. And when the creature remained calm, when it did not lash out or retreat, something in his posture shifted, subtle but significant, as if a question had been answered, though not fully understood. Again, he said, quieter this time, and Elena hesitated only a moment before lifting her hand once more, drawn by the same invisible pull that had guided her before, and as her fingers brushed against the creature's fur, the warmth returned instantly, stronger, brighter, filling her chest, and spreading outward with a certainty that left no room for doubt. And the creature lowered its head again without hesitation, as if responding to a call it had been waiting to hear. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the crowd, quickly suppressed, but impossible to ignore, because the repetition removed any chance of coincidence, any lingering belief that what they were witnessing was an accident. And the weight of that realization settled over the arena like a tangible force. Elena's heart pounded, not from fear, but from the overwhelming sense that something far beyond her understanding was unfolding, something that placed her at the center of a story she had never chosen but could no longer avoid. Lucian stepped closer still, now within arm's reach, and for the first time, Elena could feel the full weight of his presence, not just as a king, but as something more, something powerful and controlled and deeply aware, and it sent a subtle tension through her, not enough to break her focus, but enough to remind her that this moment belonged to him as much as it did to her. His gaze dropped briefly to her hand, then to the creature, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet intensity that cut through everything else. "It recognizes you," he said, not as a question, but as a statement, and Elena swallowed, her throat tight, because she could feel it too, not just recognition, but something deeper, something that felt dangerously close to belonging. She did not answer, because she did not know how, did not have the words to explain something she barely understood herself. And the silence that followed was not empty, but heavy with meaning, with implications that reached far beyond the arena, beyond this moment, into a future that was shifting even now. The creature exhaled once more, its breath steady, and Elena closed her eyes briefly, grounding herself in that warmth, in that connection, because she could feel it clearly now. Whatever this was, whatever had awakened between them, it was not temporary, it was not fragile. It was something that would not simply fade when this moment ended. And as she opened her eyes again, meeting the king's gaze once more, she realized with a quiet, undeniable certainty that the question was no longer what she was, but what he would do now that he had seen her. The moment stretched thinner, tighter, like a thread pulled between three forces that could no longer ignore each other. And Elena felt it most clearly in the way her chest rose and fell, not from fear, but from something sharper, something that demanded awareness, because the warmth inside her was no longer gentle. It pulsed now with intent, as if it recognized that it was being seen, being tested, and it refused to retreat. Lucian did not move immediately, but his gaze sharpened, tracking every subtle shift, every breath, every reaction from both her and the creature, and though his expression remained controlled, there was a depth beneath it now, something calculating, something ancient, as if he was reaching back through knowledge long buried to match what stood before him with something he had once been taught to dismiss as myth. "No one else," he said slowly, more to himself than to her, though the words carried clearly, "has ever held its attention without command." And the weight of that truth settled heavily into the arena, because everyone present understood what he meant, understood that this was not just unusual, it was unprecedented. Elena's fingers trembled slightly against the creature's fur, not from weakness, but from the growing awareness that this moment was no longer contained within her control, It was unfolding into something larger, something that would demand answers she did not yet have, and yet she could not pull away, could not break the connection that now felt as essential as her own breath. The creature shifted again, not rising, not retreating, but adjusting its position subtly, aligning itself more directly with her, as if placing her at the center of its awareness. And that small movement sent another ripple through the crowd, because it was not just stillness now. It was preference, it was choice. Elena swallowed, her throat tight, and for a moment, doubt flickered at the edges of her mind. Not doubt in what was happening, but in what it meant, in what it would cost her once this moment ended, because she knew enough about the world to understand that power did not go unnoticed, and it was never left alone. "Look at me," Lucian said then, his voice quieter, but carrying an authority that made the air itself seem to listen, and Elena hesitated only a fraction of a second before lifting her gaze fully to meet his, her heart pounding as those silver eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made everything else fade. There was no hostility there, no immediate judgment. But there was no softness either, only focus, only a deliberate effort to understand what stood before him, and it sent a strange tension through her, not fear, but awareness, as if she was being measured in ways she could not see. "Do you command it?" he asked, and the question landed differently than the ones before it, because this one implied control, implied power that could be directed, used, and Elena felt the warmth in her chest pulse sharply in response, almost as if rejecting the idea. She shook her head slightly, her voice steady despite the storm building beneath her ribs. "No, I do not think it is that." And even as she said the words, she knew they were true, because nothing about this felt like control, nothing about it felt like dominance. It felt like something else entirely, something mutual, something chosen. Lucian studied her for a long moment, his gaze flickering briefly to the creature and back again, and something in his expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable, as if her answer had confirmed a suspicion rather than denied one, and the realization seemed to settle into him with quiet weight. "Then it is choosing you," he said, and the words, simple as they were, struck deeper than anything else he had spoken, because they gave shape to what she had been feeling, gave language to the connection she could not explain, and for a moment, Elena's breath caught as the truth of it settled into her chest. The creature exhaled softly, its head lowering just slightly more, pressing into her hand again as if affirming the statement, and the warmth surged in response, stronger than before, no longer flickering, but steady, grounded, and Elena felt it anchor her in place, giving her a strength she had never known she possessed. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was charged, filled with the weight of realization spreading through every person watching, because this was no longer an isolated moment. It was a shift in understanding, a fracture in the order they had always relied on. Elena's thoughts raced despite her. Outward stillness, fragments of memory surfacing and fading, her mother's warnings, the quiet moments she had never been able to explain, the way animals had always seemed to respond to her differently, the way she had been told to hide, to stay small, to never draw attention, and now, standing here under the full gaze of the king himself, she realized that hiding had never erased what she was. It had only delayed this moment. Lucian stepped closer again, now standing directly beside her, close enough that she could feel the faint shift in the air as he moved, and though he did not touch her, his presence was unmistakable, a constant reminder that whatever came next would not be hers to face alone, whether that was a comfort or a threat. She could not yet tell. "You will come with me," he said finally, his voice calm, but carrying the finality of a decision already made, and the words settled into her like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything she had just begun to understand. Elena's fingers tightened slightly against the creature's fur, instinctively, as if anchoring herself before something changed again, and for a moment, she did not respond, not out of defiance, but because she could feel the shift coming, could feel that whatever path had opened beneath her feet was about to move, to pull her forward whether she was ready or not. The creature remained still, but its presence felt different now, more alert, more aware of the change in tension, and Elena sensed it as clearly as her own breath, the connection between them stretching but not breaking, holding firm even as the world around them began to move again. She finally lifted her gaze to Lucian once more, searching his expression for something. Anything that might tell her what this meant, what he intended. But his face remained controlled, unreadable, revealing nothing beyond the certainty that he would not leave this unanswered. And in that moment, Elena understood something with quiet clarity. This was no longer about surviving the arena, no longer about proving that what had happened was real. This was about what came after, about the choices that would follow, and whether she was ready or not. Those choices were no longer hers alone to make. The words lingered in the air long after Lucian spoke them, not loud, not forceful, but absolute in a way that left no space for refusal, and Elena felt them settle into her chest with a weight that was both grounding and unsettling, because she understood what it meant to be summoned by the king, understood that it was not an invitation, not something one could simply decline, and yet the warmth within her did not shrink, did not retreat into fear the way it once would have. It remained steady, almost defiant, as if whatever had awakened inside her refused to be silenced again. Her fingers remained pressed gently against the creature, but now she could feel the subtle tension beneath its stillness, not aggression, not resistance, but awareness, as if it too sensed the shift, the change in direction, and was waiting for something it could not name. Elena drew in a slow breath, her thoughts moving quickly now, piecing together what little she understood, what little she could hold on to in a moment that was growing larger than she could contain. And though uncertainty pressed at the edges of her mind, something deeper held her steady, something that told her she had already crossed the point where fear alone could guide her. Choices. She slowly lifted her hand from the creature once more carefully this time, as if acknowledging the connection rather than breaking it. And though the warmth dimmed slightly, it did not disappear. It lingered, quiet but present, like an ember waiting beneath the surface. The creature's head followed the motion just a fraction, not rising, not resisting, but watching, and that single movement sent a ripple through the arena again. Quieter this time, but no less powerful because it was no longer about surprise. It was about recognition, about the undeniable truth that had taken root before them all. Elena stepped back one pace, then another, her movements slow, deliberate, and the creature did not advance, did not protest. It remained where it was, its gaze fixed on her with that same unyielding awareness. And for a brief moment, she felt the distance between them like a thread stretched tight, not broken, but changed, and it sent a quiet ache through her chest that she did not fully understand. Lucian watched every movement, his attention unwavering, and when she had put enough distance between herself and the creature, he turned slightly, a subtle gesture that immediately shifted the tension in the air, because it was not just a movement, it was a signal, one that the guards and attendants recognized without question. Footsteps sounded at the edges of the arena, controlled, careful, but hesitant, because even now, no one fully trusted what they had just witnessed. No one fully understood what would happen if they stepped too close. And that hesitation spoke louder than any command could have. Elena's gaze flickered briefly toward them, then back to the creature, drawn by something she could not ignore, and for a moment, she considered reaching out again, considered closing that distance once more, but the presence beside her, steady and commanding, reminded her that the moment had already shifted, that what came next would not be decided by instinct alone. "It will not follow without you," Lucian said quietly, not as a question, but as an observation. And Elena felt the truth of it settle immediately, because she could feel it, that subtle pull that still connected them, the sense that if she turned and walked away entirely, something would be left unresolved, something unfinished. She hesitated, her fingers curling slightly at her side, and for the first time since this began, uncertainty returned, not the kind born from fear, but the kind that came from standing at the edge of something unknown, something that would change everything once she stepped forward. "I do not know how to make it move," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tension beneath it, and Lucian's gaze shifted to her again, sharper now, more focused, as if her words had confirmed something he was beginning to understand. "You do not make it," he replied, his tone calm, certain. "You allow it to choose." And the simplicity of the statement struck her more deeply than she expected, because it aligned with everything she had felt, everything she had experienced in those moments of connection, and for the first time, she realized that what she carried was not something to control, but something to trust. Elena drew in another breath, steadying herself, and slowly, deliberately, she turned her body toward the exit of the arena, her movements measured, careful not to break the fragile balance that still lingered in the air, and for a heartbeat, nothing happened, the silence stretching once more into something almost unbearable. Then, behind her, a shift, subtle but undeniable, the sound of movement not forced, not commanded, but chosen, and the awareness of it sent a quiet tremor through her chest. She did not turn immediately, did not need to, because she could feel it, the connection responding, aligning, and when she finally allowed herself to glance back, her breath caught again, not in fear, but in awe, because the creature had risen, not in defiance, not in unrest, but in calm, deliberate motion, its attention fixed on her as it took a single step forward, then another, each movement controlled, intentional, as if following a path only it could see. The arena held its breath once more, but this time, it was different, not disbelief, not confusion, but something closer to reverence, because what they were witnessing was no longer an anomaly. It was a pattern, a truth unfolding in real time. Elena's heart pounded, the warmth in her chest flaring again in response, stronger than before, as if acknowledging the bond that had formed between them. And for the first time, she felt something like certainty take root within her, fragile but real, that whatever this was, it was not temporary. It was not something that would fade once she stepped beyond these walls. Lucian moved beside her again, his presence steady, his gaze forward now, as if already looking beyond the arena, beyond the moment, to what would come next. And though he did not speak again, the decision he had made lingered in the air between them, shaping everything that followed. Elena took one more step toward the exit, then another, her breath steady despite the storm building around her, and behind her, the creature followed, not as a weapon, not as something bound, but as something that had chosen its place. And as the distance between her past and whatever future awaited her grew with each step, she understood, with quiet clarity, that there would be no returning to who she had been before this moment, because something had awakened, and it was not going back to sleep. The corridor beyond the arena felt colder, quieter, as if the world itself had narrowed to the sound of her footsteps and the steady, deliberate presence moving behind her. And Elena became acutely aware of every inch of space around her, of the stone beneath her feet, of the faint echo that followed each step, and most of all, of the invisible thread that still connected her to the creature, stretching but never breaking as they crossed the threshold together. No one spoke as they moved, not the guards who lined the passage with rigid stillness, not the attendants who watched with wide, uncertain eyes, and certainly not the king at her side, whose silence carried more weight than any command could have, because it was not empty, it was filled with thought, with calculation, with something that was still unfolding behind those unreadable silver eyes. Elena kept her gaze forward, but her senses were no longer confined to what she could see. They stretched outward, brushing against the presence behind her, sensing the rhythm of its movement, the quiet assurance in each step, and it both steadied and unsettled her, because it felt natural in a way that nothing else in her life ever had. The warmth in her chest pulsed in time with that awareness, not as strongly as before, but present enough to remind her that the connection had not ended. It had only changed, adapting to this new distance, this new path they were walking together. A faint shift in the air signaled Lucian's attention turning slightly toward her, and though he did not speak immediately, she could feel it, the weight of his focus sharpening, narrowing, as if the quiet of the corridor had given him space to consider what he had witnessed without distraction. "You felt it before today," he said finally, his voice low, controlled, but carrying a certainty that made it clear he was not asking blindly. And Elena's breath faltered for just a second, because the question reached deeper than anything he had said before. She hesitated, not because she wanted to hide the truth, but because she had spent so long pretending it did not exist that giving it voice felt unfamiliar, almost dangerous. And yet the silence between them did not allow for evasion. It waited, patient but firm, until she answered. Not like this, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the memory stirring beneath it. But something has always been there. And as the words left her, she felt the warmth respond, a faint surge that confirmed what she had never fully allowed herself to accept. Lucian did not react immediately, but she sensed the shift in him, subtle but significant, as if her admission had aligned with something he had already begun to suspect, and when he spoke again, his tone carried a different weight, less questioning, more certain. "And you were told to hide it," he said, and this time, it was not a guess. It was a statement shaped by understanding. Elena's fingers curled slightly at her side, the old instinct to deny, to minimize, rising briefly before she let it settle. Because there was no point in hiding now, not after what had already been revealed. "Yes," she said simply, and the single word carried years of quiet obedience, of shrinking herself to fit a world that had no place for what she was. The corridor stretched ahead of them, long and dimly lit, but Elena barely noticed the details anymore. Her awareness split between the man beside her and the presence behind her, both of which felt equally significant, equally impossible to ignore. The creature's footsteps remained steady, controlled, never rushing, never faltering, and the guards who lined the walls shifted subtly as it passed, not out of fear alone, but out of something closer to respect, because even without understanding, they could feel that something had changed. Elena's breath slowed as she adjusted to the rhythm of it all, to the strange balance that had formed between them, and for the first time since leaving the arena, a question surfaced in her mind, not driven by fear, but by something quieter, something that needed to be understood. "What will happen now?" she asked, her voice soft but clear, and the question lingered between them, heavier than it seemed, because it carried more than curiosity. It carried the weight of everything that had just been set into motion. Lucian did not answer immediately, his gaze fixed ahead, his expression unchanged, but she could feel the shift in him again, the way his thoughts moved, the way he measured what could be said and what could not. And when he finally spoke, his words were deliberate, chosen with care. "That depends on what you are," he said, and though the answer was not what she had hoped for, it was not unexpected, because she had already begun to understand that her identity was no longer something she could ignore or postpone. The warmth in her chest pulsed again, quieter this time, but steady, as if reminding her that whatever the answer was, it existed within her, waiting to be uncovered. The corridor began to widen ahead, opening into a larger space filled with softer light, and Elena slowed slightly, her steps instinctively cautious as the atmosphere shifted once more, less confined, but no less intense. Behind her, the creature followed without hesitation, its presence as constant as her own breath, and she realized then that this connection, whatever it was, would not simply fade when circumstances changed. It would remain, adapting, growing, shaping itself to whatever came next. Lucian stepped forward first as they reached the threshold of the chamber beyond, his movement smooth, controlled, and for a brief moment, Elena hesitated at the edge, her gaze flickering back over her shoulder, drawn once more to the creature that had altered everything in a matter of minutes. It stood just behind her now, its gaze steady, aware, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to narrow again to just the two of them, the invisible thread between them humming with quiet intensity. And Elena felt something settle within her, not fear, not doubt, but a fragile, undeniable sense of connection that refused to be dismissed. She turned back without speaking, stepping forward into the light of the chamber. And as she crossed that threshold, she understood with quiet certainty that whatever lay ahead, whatever answers waited to be uncovered, they would not belong to her alone anymore, because something had chosen her, and in doing so, it had changed everything. The chamber they entered felt nothing like the arena, yet the tension followed them inside, settling into the high ceilings and stone walls as if it had been waiting there long before they arrived. And Elena became aware of how quiet it was, not the uncertain silence of before, but a controlled stillness, deliberate, shaped by the presence of power rather than fear. Soft light spilled in from tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. And for a moment, the contrast between this place and where she had just been made everything feel unreal, as if she had stepped into a different world entirely. one where she did not yet understand the rules. Lucian moved ahead without hesitation, his pace measured, confident, and though he did not look back, his awareness remained sharp, as if he did not need to see her to know exactly where she was. And that quiet certainty in his presence both grounded and unsettled her in equal measure. Elena followed a few steps behind, her gaze drifting briefly around the chamber before returning forward, because even here, in this calmer space, she could still feel the pull behind her, steady and undeniable, and she did not need to turn to know that the creature had crossed the threshold as well, its presence filling the room in a way that could not be ignored, yet somehow did not disrupt the balance of it. The doors closed behind them with a soft, final sound, and the faint echo seemed to mark the end of something and the beginning of something else. And Elena felt it settle deep within her, that quiet shift from uncertainty to inevitability, because there was no turning back now. Lucian stopped near the center of the chamber and turned to face her fully for the first time since they had left the arena, his expression unchanged, composed, yet there was a depth behind his gaze now that had not been there before, something more focused, more deliberate, as if he had moved from observing to deciding. Elena slowed to a stop as well, the distance between them measured, respectful, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching again, but this time it felt different, not fragile, not uncertain, but filled with something waiting to be uncovered. Behind her, the creature settled, its movement quiet, controlled, and when Elena finally allowed herself to glance back, she saw that it had lowered itself once more, not fully at rest, but in a posture that mirrored awareness rather than submission, and that subtle distinction sent another quiet realization through her. This was not obedience. This was presence, chosen and given freely. She turned back slowly, her breath steadying as she faced the king again, and though she did not yet know what he intended, she could feel that whatever came next would define more than just this moment. "Tell me exactly what you felt," Lucian said, his voice calm but direct, and the request carried no softness, no attempt to ease the weight of what he was asking. Because he did not need to, he expected truth, and nothing less. Elena hesitated only briefly, not because she wished to hide anything, but because putting it into words felt inadequate, like trying to describe something that existed beyond language, and yet she knew that silence would not serve her now, not here. "It was warmth," she began slowly, her voice quiet but steady. "Not like heat, but something deeper, like it was coming from inside me and answering something in it." And as she spoke, she felt the faint pulse in her chest respond, as if acknowledging the truth of her words. Lucian listened without interruption, his gaze fixed on her with that same unwavering intensity, and when she paused, searching for something more to add, he tilted his head slightly, not impatient, but expectant, as if he knew there was more beneath the surface. Elena swallowed, her fingers curling slightly as she forced herself to continue. It was not control. It was not like telling it what to do. It was like it already knew. And the words felt fragile as they left her, but they carried a truth she could not deny. And as the silence returned, she realized how much she had just revealed, not only to him, but to herself. Lucian's expression did not change immediately, but something shifted behind his eyes, something subtle yet significant, as if her words had aligned with something he had been searching for. And when he finally spoke again, his tone carried a weight that made her chest tighten slightly. "Then it is not your strength that matters," he said. "It is your nature." And the distinction settled heavily into the space between them, because it implied something far more intrinsic, something that could not be learned or controlled, only understood. Elena's breath caught faintly, because she had spent her entire life being told that her nature was something to hide, something to diminish, and now, standing here, it was being treated as something else entirely, something that held value she had never been allowed to see. The creature shifted slightly behind her, its presence a constant reminder that whatever Lucian was suggesting was not theory, it was proven, it had already happened, and that realization made it impossible to dismiss. Lucian stepped closer, not invading her space, but closing the distance enough that his presence became more immediate, more tangible, and though his expression remained composed, there was something else there now, something that felt almost like certainty, as if he had reached a conclusion he could not ignore. There are old records, he said quietly, stories dismissed as legend, about those who could not command, but connect, who were not obeyed, but chosen. And the words carried a weight that reached beyond the present, beyond the walls of the chamber, into something older, something that had been forgotten or deliberately ignored. Elena's heart pounded softly, not from fear, but from the growing sense that she was standing on the edge of something far larger than she had ever imagined, something that reached back through time and forward into a future she could not yet see. They were not meant to exist anymore, Lucian continued, his gaze steady on hers. And yet here you are. And the quiet finality of the statement left no room for doubt. Because he was no longer questioning what she was, he was acknowledging it. The silence that followed was heavy, but not oppressive. It was filled with the weight of realization, of possibilities unfolding in ways neither of them had fully anticipated, and Elena felt it settle into her chest. Not as fear, but as something else, something that felt dangerously close to purpose. Behind her, the creature exhaled softly, its presence steady, unwavering, and for the first time since entering the chamber, Elena allowed herself to fully accept what it represented, not a threat, not a burden, but a connection that had chosen her, that had answered something within her she had never understood until now. And as she stood there, facing the king who now saw her not as insignificant, not as invisible, but as something rare, something impossible, she realized that whatever came next would not simply shape her life, it would redefine it entirely, because the question was no longer whether she belonged in this world, but what place she would claim within it. If what you are is real, Lucian said slowly, his voice quieter now, but carrying a weight that pressed against the air itself, then this kingdom has been blind for generations. And the words did not sound like doubt, they sounded like realization, like something long buried rising to the surface whether it was wanted or not. Elena felt her breath catch as the statement settled into her, not because she fully understood it, but because she could feel the truth of it in the way the warmth inside her responded, steady and undeniable, as if something ancient within her had been waiting for those words to be spoken aloud. The chamber seemed to grow even more still, as if the walls themselves were listening, holding on to every word, every shift in tone, and Elena became aware of how alone they truly were in this moment. Despite the presence of guards beyond the doors, despite the weight of the entire kingdom pressing just beyond reach, because what was unfolding here was not meant for witnesses, not yet. Lucian's gaze did not leave her, and there was no longer any attempt to mask what lay behind it, not curiosity alone, but recognition, as if he had finally aligned what he saw before him with something he had only ever known through fragments of forgotten history. Those who could connect, he continued, his tone measured, deliberate, were not simply rare, they were feared, and the word lingered. Sharpened, quiet, and Elena felt something shift inside her at its mention, not fear in the way she had always known it, but something deeper, something that felt like memory without form. She swallowed, her fingers curling slightly at her sides, because she had lived with fear all her life, had been shaped by it, guided by it. But this felt different. This felt like something that had not belonged to her alone, something that had existed long before she was born. Why? She asked softly, the question slipping out before she could stop it, and Lucian's expression did not change, but there was a pause, brief but deliberate, as if he was deciding how much to reveal. Because they could not be controlled, he answered at last, and the simplicity of it struck harder than any explanation could have, because it aligned too perfectly with everything she had just experienced, everything she had felt in that connection that refused to be commanded, refused to be forced. Elena's breath steadied slowly, and she glanced briefly toward the creature behind her, its presence still calm, still unwavering, and for a moment, she saw it differently. Not as something powerful in isolation, but as part of something larger, something that included her in a way she had never been included in anything before. The warmth in her chest pulsed again, stronger now, as if responding to the understanding taking shape, and she felt it spread outward, not overwhelming, but steady, grounding, anchoring her in a way that made it impossible to deny. Lucian stepped closer once more, not invading her space, but closing the distance enough that his presence felt immediate, undeniable, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a quieter intensity, one that did not demand, but expected. "Show me," he said, and the words were simple, but they carried an unmistakable challenge, not of strength, but of truth. Elena hesitated, not because she did not want to, but because she did not know how, did not know if what had happened in the arena could be called upon again at will. And for a moment, uncertainty flickered at the edges of her confidence, threatening to pull her back into the smaller version of herself she had always been. But then the warmth responded, steady and certain, as if reminding her that this was not something external, not something she needed to summon from outside herself. It was already there, already waiting, and slowly, carefully, she turned her attention inward, focusing on that quiet pulse, that steady presence that had guided her before. Her breath slowed, her senses narrowing, not in fear, but in focus. And she became aware of the connection again, faint at first, then stronger, like a thread being drawn taut between her and the creature. And when she turned slightly, lifting her hand once more, she did not hesitate this time. She did not question it. She simply allowed it. Her fingers extended toward the creature, not reaching in uncertainty, but moving with quiet intention, and as the distance closed, the warmth surged again, immediate and undeniable, filling her chest and flowing down her arm. And the moment her hand brushed against its fur, the connection ignited. Fully, stronger than before, clearer, more defined, as if it had been waiting for her to understand how to meet it halfway. The creature responded instantly, its head lowering in that same deliberate motion, its posture shifting not in submission, but in acknowledgement, and Elena felt it clearly now, the exchange between them, not words, not commands, but something deeper, something that bypassed language entirely. Lucian watched closely, his gaze sharp, focused, and though his expression remained controlled, there was no hiding the intensity of his attention now, because this was no longer an anomaly. This was confirmation, and he understood it as clearly as she did. Elena's heart pounded, but not from fear, from the overwhelming clarity of what she was experiencing. And for the first time, she did not question it, did not doubt it. She accepted it, fully, completely, and in doing so, the connection deepened, becoming something stable, something real. The creature exhaled softly, its breath warm against her skin, and Elena closed her eyes for just a moment, grounding herself in that sensation, in that quiet certainty, because she could feel it now, not just what she was, but what she could become. And though the path ahead remained uncertain, the foundation beneath her feet no longer felt fragile. When she opened her eyes again, she met Lucian's gaze without hesitation, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, something that shifted the balance of everything that had come before, because he no longer looked at her as something to be understood, but as something to be reckoned with. And though neither of them spoke it aloud, the truth had already settled into the space between them. Whatever she was, whatever this connection meant, it was not something that could be hidden again, and it would not be ignored. The connection did not fade when she opened her eyes. It remained, steady and alive, like a quiet current running beneath everything. And Elena felt it anchor her in a way that made the world seem sharper, clearer, as if she was no longer observing from the edges but standing fully within it for the first time. Lucian did not look away, and there was no longer any question in his gaze, only recognition, only the undeniable shift from uncertainty to acceptance, and that alone sent a quiet tremor through her chest, because she understood what it meant to be seen by someone like him, not as insignificant, not as invisible, but as something that could not be dismissed. The creature remained still beneath her hand, its presence calm, aware, and for a moment, the three of them stood in a balance that felt fragile and unbreakable all at once, as if something had aligned that could not easily be undone. "This is not coincidence," Lucian said at last, his voice low but firm, and the words settled into the space between them with finality, because he was no longer testing, no longer questioning. He was stating a truth he had chosen to accept. Elena's breath steadied as she listened, her fingers still resting lightly against the creature, and though part of her still struggled to grasp the full weight of what was happening, another part, deeper, quieter, understood that this moment had already changed everything, whether she was ready or not. Lucian's gaze shifted briefly to the creature, then back to her, and there was something new in his expression now, something that had not been there before, not just recognition, but calculation shaped by purpose, as if he was already considering what this meant beyond the walls of this chamber, beyond the moment they stood in. If this ability exists in you, he continued, then it changes more than your life. And the implication of his words lingered, heavy and undeniable, because they reached far beyond her, into the structure of everything she had known. Elena swallowed softly, her chest tightening as the reality of that settled in, because she had spent her entire life trying to remain unseen, trying to avoid drawing attention, and now, standing here, she could feel that there was no returning to that, no slipping back into the quiet existence she had once clung to. The warmth in her chest pulsed again, steady and certain, as if reinforcing that truth, as if reminding her that what she carried was not something that could be hidden anymore. There are those who will not accept this, Lucian said, his voice quieter now, but no less certain, and Elena felt a subtle shift in the air at his words, because they carried not just observation, but warning, and the meaning behind them was clear. Power that could not be controlled would never go unchallenged. Her fingers curled slightly against the creature's fur, grounding herself in the connection that still held firm, and for a brief moment, doubt flickered again, not about what she was, but about what would come next, about whether she was prepared for the weight of it. The creature responded to that shift instantly, its head lowering just slightly more, pressing into her hand with a quiet steadiness that seemed to counter the uncertainty rising within her. And the warmth surged in response, stronger, more grounding, as if reminding her that she was not standing alone in this. Elena exhaled slowly, her shoulders easing as the connection steadied her once more, and when she lifted her gaze back to Lucian, there was something different in her expression, something more resolved, because though she did not yet know what path lay ahead, she understood that retreat was no longer an option. Lucian watched her closely, and for a moment, something almost imperceptible shifted in his posture, a subtle acknowledgement, as if he recognized the change in her, the quiet strength that had begun to take root where fear once held its place. Then we do not give them the chance to decide for us, he said, his voice firm, controlled, and the statement carried a quiet authority that did not demand agreement, but expected it. And Elena felt it settle into her, with surprising clarity, because it aligned with something she had not yet fully formed into thought, the realization that this was no longer just about what others would see, but about what she would choose to become. The chamber seemed to hold its breath again, but this time, it was not waiting for uncertainty to break, it was waiting for direction, for the next step to be taken, and Elena felt the weight of that expectation settle into her chest alongside the warmth. Not crushing, but steady, like something that could be carried if she chose to bear it. She glanced briefly toward the creature once more, its presence constant, unwavering, and for the first time, she did not see it as something separate from herself, not entirely, but as something connected, something that had responded to her not by force, but by recognition, and that realization brought with it a quiet strength she had never known. When she turned back to Lucian, her voice was still soft, but it no longer carried uncertainty. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, and the question was not one of submission, but of alignment, of understanding where this path would lead. Lucian did not answer immediately, his gaze steady, his expression unchanged, but there was something deliberate in the silence that followed, as if he was weighing not just the question, but the future it implied, and when he finally spoke, his words were simple, but they carried the weight of something far greater. "Stay where you are seen," he said, and the meaning behind it was unmistakable, because it was not about physical position, it was about presence, about visibility, about refusing to return to the shadows she had once been forced into. Elena's breath caught faintly at the words, because they challenged everything she had been taught, everything she had believed was necessary to survive. And yet, standing here, with the warmth steady in her chest and the connection at her fingertips, she understood that survival was no longer the only measure that mattered. The creature exhaled softly behind her, its presence a constant reminder of what had already changed. And Elena felt the truth settle into her bones with quiet certainty. Whatever came next, whatever challenges awaited beyond these walls, she would not face them as the girl she had been before, because that version of her no longer fit the world she now stood in. And for the first time, the unknown ahead did not feel like something to fear, but something to step into. The words settled into her more deeply than anything else he had said, not because they were loud or forceful, but because they challenged the very foundation of who she had been taught to be. And Elena stood there for a moment longer than necessary, her breath slow and steady, as she let them take root, as she allowed herself to understand what it meant to remain visible in a world that had always demanded her silence. The warmth in her chest responded again, not as a sudden surge, but as a steady, grounding presence, as if it approved of the choice she had not yet spoken aloud. And behind her, the creature shifted subtly, its presence unwavering, reinforcing the quiet certainty building within her. Lucian did not rush her, did not press for an immediate response, and that alone spoke volumes. Because he was not asking for obedience, he was waiting for recognition, for alignment, for a decision that came from her rather than being imposed upon her. And that realization changed the weight of everything he had said. Elena lifted her chin slightly, not in defiance, but in quiet resolve, and though her voice remained soft when she spoke, it carried a steadiness that had not been there before. "Then I will not hide," she said, and the words felt both foreign and familiar, as if she was speaking something that had always been true but had never been allowed to exist. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, charged with the weight of that choice, and Lucian's gaze held hers for a long moment, as if measuring the truth of it, as if confirming that this was not hesitation, not fear disguised as courage, but something real, something that would not falter at the first challenge. A faint shift in his posture followed, subtle but undeniable, and though he did not smile, there was a quiet acknowledgement in his expression, something that recognized the significance of what she had just said, not as a simple agreement, but as a turning point. "Good," he said finally, and the single word carried more weight than any extended praise could have, because it was not given lightly, it was given with purpose. Elena exhaled slowly, the tension she had not fully realized she was holding easing just slightly, and for a brief moment, the world felt balanced again, not because everything was resolved, but because she had taken her first step into whatever came next. Behind her, the creature exhaled softly, its presence steady, and she felt the connection between them respond once more, not flaring, not demanding, but affirming, as if acknowledging her choice in its own quiet way. Lucian turned then, his movements smooth and deliberate, and though he did not issue a command, the shift in his attention was enough to signal that the moment of stillness had ended, that the next phase had already begun. "There will be questions," he said as he moved toward the far side of the chamber, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of certainty, "and not all of them will come with patience." And the warning was clear, not spoken to frighten her, but to prepare her, to ensure that she understood what visibility would bring. Elena followed a step behind, her pace steady, and though the words might have unsettled her before, she found that they did not carry the same weight now, not in the presence of the warmth that continued to anchor her, not with the steady awareness of the creature behind her. "Then I will answer them," she said quietly, and though she did not yet know how, the certainty in her voice surprised even herself, because it came not from knowledge, but from acceptance, from the understanding that she could no longer step away from what she was. Lucian glanced at her briefly, his gaze sharp, assessing, and though he did not respond immediately, there was a subtle shift in his expression, something that suggested approval, not of her words alone, but of the resolve behind them. They reached the far side of the chamber where another set of doors stood, larger, more imposing, and Elena felt a subtle shift in the air as they approached, as if what lay beyond carried a different kind of weight, something broader, something that extended beyond this controlled space. She slowed slightly, her gaze lifting to the doors, and for a brief moment, the reality of what waited beyond them pressed in, not as fear, but as awareness, because she knew that once she stepped through, whatever had been contained within these walls would no longer be hidden, no longer private. It would become something the world could see. The warmth in her chest pulsed again, steady and reassuring, and she felt it ground her once more, reminding her of the connection she carried, of the truth she could no longer deny. Behind her, the creature remained close, its presence constant, and for a moment, she allowed herself to feel it fully, the quiet strength of it, the certainty of its choice, and it settled something within her that doubt could not reach. Lucian stopped before the doors, his hand resting lightly against the surface, and though he did not open them immediately, the pause was not hesitation, it was intention, a final moment of stillness before everything shifted outward. Once we step through, he said, his voice lower now, more deliberate, there is no returning to what you were. And the statement did not carry warning alone. It carried truth, undeniable and absolute. Elena drew in a slow breath, her heart steady despite the weight of the moment. And though a part of her still remembered the quiet life she had left behind, the safety of being unseen, she understood now that it had never truly been safety. It had been limitation, and she could not return to it even if she tried. She lifted her gaze, meeting his without hesitation, and though she did not speak, the answer was clear in her expression, in the steadiness of her posture, in the quiet strength that had taken root within her. Lucian studied her for a brief moment longer, then nodded once, a small, decisive motion, and with that, he pushed the doors open. Light spilled through the opening, brighter, wider, carrying with it the distant sounds of movement, of voices, of a world that had not yet realized what had changed within these walls. And Elena stepped forward without pause, crossing the threshold with a steady breath, the warmth in her chest and the presence behind her guiding her forward. And as the space opened around her, as the world beyond began to take shape, she understood with quiet certainty that this was not an end, not even a beginning, but a turning point, the moment where what had been hidden stepped into the light, and nothing that followed would ever be the same. The light did not blind her, but it revealed everything. And Elena felt it the moment she stepped fully into the open hall, the shift from contained silence to a space alive with movement and awareness, where every sound seemed sharper, every presence more defined, and most of all, every gaze turned toward her with a force she had never experienced before. Conversations faltered, footsteps slowed, and a ripple moved through the gathered crowd, subtle at first, then undeniable, as recognition gave way to something else. Something heavier, something uncertain, because they did not just see her, they saw what followed her. Elena kept her posture steady, her chin lifted just enough to meet the weight of those stares without shrinking beneath them. And though her heart beat faster, the warmth in her chest remained constant, anchoring her in a way that made it impossible to retreat into the shadows she had once known. Beside her, Lucian moved with the same controlled confidence as always, unaffected by the shift in the room, as if he had already accepted what this moment would bring, and his presence alone steadied the space, giving it structure, giving it direction. Behind her, the creature stepped forward into the light, and the effect was immediate, the ripple through the hall, deepening into silence, not forced, not commanded, but instinctive, because even without understanding, every person present could feel that something had changed, something that could not be ignored. Elena did not turn, did not need to, because she could feel it, the connection stretching between them, steady and unbroken, and for the first time, she did not question it, did not try to hide it. She allowed it to exist fully, openly, as part of who she was. A figure near the front of the hall stepped forward, hesitation evident in the slight pause before he spoke. "Your Majesty, is this controlled?" And the question hung in the air, fragile and dangerous, because it revealed the fear beneath the surface, the need to categorize, to contain, to understand within the limits they had always relied on. Lucian did not answer immediately, and in that brief silence, Elena felt the weight of the moment shift again, because this was not just about her anymore. It was about what the world would choose to believe, about how they would respond to something that refused to fit their expectations. "No," Lucian said at last, his voice calm, but carrying across the hall with absolute clarity. "It is not controlled." And the truth of it settled into the room like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward that could not be stopped. A murmur rose, quickly suppressed, but impossible to contain entirely. And Elena felt it press against her, not as hostility, not yet, but as uncertainty, as the beginning of something that would grow into questions, into challenges, into resistance. She drew in a slow breath, the warmth in her chest responding immediately, steadying her, and she realized then that this was the moment Lucian had spoken of, the moment where she would either step forward or be pushed back into the silence she had once accepted. The creature behind her shifted slightly, its presence unwavering, and she felt it clearly, the quiet support in that connection, the steady acknowledgement that she was not standing alone, and that realization settled something deep within her. Elena took a single step forward, small but deliberate, and the movement drew every eye in the hall, focusing the attention onto her in a way that might have overwhelmed her before. But now, she met it without lowering her gaze. "It chose," she said, her voice soft, but clear enough to carry in the silence. And though the words were simple, they held a truth that could not be denied, not after what they had witnessed. The murmur shifted again, quieter now, more focused, and Elena could feel the change. The shift from dismissal to consideration, because they were no longer looking at her as something insignificant. They were trying to understand what she represented. Lucian remained still beside her, his gaze moving across the room, measuring the reaction, allowing the moment to unfold rather than controlling it. And that choice gave her space, gave her the chance to stand in what she had become without being overshadowed. The warmth in her chest pulsed again, stronger now, and she felt it spread outward, not physically, but in presence, in the way her voice steadied, in the way her posture held firm, and she realized that this was what it meant to be seen, not just by others, but by herself. The creature exhaled softly behind her, the sound quiet but grounding, and Elena felt the connection respond, steady and unwavering, as if reinforcing everything she had just spoken. A second voice rose from the crowd, more cautious this time. "And if it chooses again?" And the question lingered, carrying both curiosity and concern, because it implied something larger, something that could not be easily contained. Elena's breath slowed, and for a moment, she did not answer, not because she did not have one, but because she understood the weight of it, understood that whatever she said next would shape how they saw her, how they responded to her. And for the first time, she did not look to Lucian for guidance. She did not seek his approval. She stood in the space she had claimed. "Then it will not be alone," she said quietly, and the meaning of her words settled into the room with quiet force, because she was no longer speaking as someone uncertain, someone hidden. She was speaking as someone who had accepted what she was, even if she did not yet fully understand it. The silence that followed was different from any that had come before, not uncertain, not fragile, but heavy with realization, because something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, something that would ripple far beyond this moment. Lucian's gaze returned to her, and for a brief second, something passed between them, not surprise, not doubt, but recognition, as if he saw not just what she was, but what she had chosen to become. And as Elena stood there, no longer shrinking beneath the weight of the world's attention, no longer hiding from the truth within her, she understood with quiet certainty that this was only the beginning, not of a story written for her, but of one she would now help shape, because the moment the world saw her, it also began to change, and somewhere deep within that change, something greater had already started to awaken.